we go. Hello, I am Charlie Winterbauer, co-chair of the Southeast chapter of the North Carolina Native Plant Society, and I am hosting the 2020 Native Plant Festival. It's the virtual one this year, so hence this recording, and I'm pleased to have Camilla Herlevich giving a talk, and go for it, Camilla.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm happy to be here. I think I know a lot of folks who are other speakers at the Native Plant Society Festival today, and many of you who are members, so I feel as though I'm among friends. And I have taken advantage of what I think is probably a highly expert and educated audience, and am giving you a presentation that's a bit more technical that I would give to our general audience at a Rotary Club or whatever else, because I know you guys know an awful lot already about coastal conservation. My topic today is the top 40 coastal conservation projects here at the coastal plain of our North Carolina. The North Carolina Coastal Land Trust is the land trust that covers the entire coastal plain of North Carolina, a whole 1/3 of the state, including the southeastern area down here, but also the mid-coast and the northeast. And our conservation strategy, since we cover an awful large area, is to be very selective in the projects that we protect. And so we call it our ABC conservation strategy of assisting others, including local and state agencies, with land conservation projects that provide for outdoor recreation and conservation of natural areas. B is for buffer existing lands, and C is for connect existing conservation lands. So our goal here in having these sort of overall guidelines is to try to maximize the benefit for the relatively small amount of resources that we have. So our mantra is buy big or save special standalone places. Beyond that, we've always had a priority list of particular watersheds or natural areas or forest types, for example, that have been on our priority list. The Coastal Land Trust has been in existence for about 27 years. It was founded by myself, Michael Murkison, Bill Rainey, and Chuck Rowe almost 27, 28 years ago. But about 5 years ago, our board of directors initiated a strategic planning process and decided that we wanted to come up with a more proactive list of the top 40 projects in the entire coastal plain. And so this was a big order. There certainly are lots of different bodies of knowledge from which to choose to make this database. But our deputy director at the time, Janice Allen, is the one who came up with the approach to take to respond to the charge that was given to her at our board of directors retreat. She started, of course, with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Programs, counting inventories, and online conservation planning tool. And for those of you who are not familiar with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, it's been in existence for probably 40 years. It's housed in the state, Diener, and it includes both written records and maps, now GIS layers, of course, that identify both rare and endangered species and ecosystems as well, habitats, classifies them in accordance with a nationwide classification system, and basically tries to inventory, map, and keep track on the special natural areas in the entire state of North Carolina. It's not an acquisition agency. It's basically a resource agency, a documentation of natural areas and resources. In addition to the Heritage Programs database, Janice Allen consulted other agencies' databases and lists, and the end result was a working database, not a list, although I've called it that here, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it is not a static list of particular projects that won't change, but one that can be adapted from time to time as land comes on the market or goes off. The other cool thing about our top 40 list is that it assumes that the Coastal Land Trust is not going to be the lead on all of these projects. So the list is not just the properties that the Coastal Land Trust wants to take on, although it is primarily that, but it recognizes that we have always had great success in working collaboratively with partners. So it could also include projects, for example, like Lee Island, which Audubon Society is working on. We developed a priority ranking system to come up with the top 40 list, and I'm going to go through these criteria with you. The idea was to be able to, instead of just having descriptors, to actually come up with a numeric ranking that we could use to screen potential projects. And the 10 criteria that we came up with, which are not necessarily weighted equally, but we're going to go through those, are ecological significance, that's drawn from the Natural Heritage Program data, biodiversity and wildlife habitat assessment, that also is drawn from the Natural Heritage Program data, but it's a bit of a larger filter than the ecological significance, if you will. Landscape position, that is something near other properties, other conservation values, the size of property, climate change resiliency, whether or not there's a willing seller, whether there is the potential for public use or access in the future, the feasibility of a project, and we also wanted to make sure that we were cognizant of the threat. So let's go through each of these. Ecological significance, which is another way of saying whether a property is a special natural area. The Natural Heritage Program has identified more than 2,500 natural areas across the state. And the definition here is that it's a site of special biodiversity significance due to the presence of rare species, unique natural communities, important animal assemblages, or other ecological features. And the slide there shows one of our top 40 projects, which actually has been closed, and that's the Gales Creek Preserve in Carteret County. It's a longleaf pine savanna, and it's just chock full of my favorite plants, Venus flytraps and other pitcher plants and carnivorous plants. The special natural area ranking also includes sites, or here's more information about them. Sites are ranked based on occurrences of rare plant and animal species, rare or high quality natural communities, or special animal habitats. And again, the methodology is designed to address both species and natural communities as elements of biodiversity. The ranking of the sites as either exceptional, very high, high, or moderate is based on the number and the rarity of elements it contains. Our criteria at the Coastal Land Trust gives a sliding scale of 15 points down to 1 point with regard to how valuable or how high a project ranks in its ecological significance. The second criteria is biodiversity and wildlife habitat. And again, we're using the Natural Heritage Program's decision model to assess natural areas and other sites in terms of their functionality and connectivity. Other sets of data that we consulted included National Audubon Society's important bird areas, the National Wetlands Inventories, Species Guild, and the Division of Water Quality's ranking of either outstanding resource waters and high quality waters. And again, we gave a maximum of 15 to this criteria, with 15 being the highest and 0 being the lowest. So you can see of our score of a possible 100, we're putting very heavy weight to the data from the Natural Heritage Program already. The third criteria is landscape position. And we have a sliding scale here, 10 points for properties that connects or are adjacent to existing conservation land. Those of you who are practiced field botanists know that the bigger the better in terms of habitat for wildlife in particular. We gave 5 points if property is located along a priority river or corridor, 3 if it's a tributary, along a tributary, and 1 if it's within the vicinity but not actually adjacent to a mile of existing conservation land. So here, a maximum of 10 points for this category. We also added in other conservation values, military values. That might surprise you. Why are military values important in a conservation ranking system? Well, the reason is that we can bring Department of Defense dollars to protect conservation projects that are near military bases, because the Department of Defense has a partnership program with organizations like ours and the Nature Conservancy, in which they bring half of the money, if we bring half of the money, to protect sites that have conservation value, but also buffer military bases, flying or training routes, or add other strategic values to the ability of a military base or installation to meet its mission. Historic values also can provide up to 10 points. High quality waters, 5 points. And working farms or forest, 1 point. The size of the property is important. Again, it's the bigger is better mantra of land conservation. A property gets 5 points if it's more than 1,000 acres, 3 points if it's between 400 and 999 acres, and 1 point if it's under 400 acres. Climate change resiliency. Those of us who live on the coast know how important, and how much more important going forward, the concept of properties being resilient in the face of climate change and storm events. So we've added in an effort to include an assessment of a property's ability to adapt to climate change, such as sea level rise or storms. We've given it a score of high if it is inland and not on a waterway, moderate if it's inland but on a coastal waterway, low if the property is directly on the coast. And clearly this is not a hugely sophisticated analysis, but at least gives some consideration of climate change resiliency, which we thought was important for our organization. The criteria number 7 is whether or not there's a willing seller. Just because we want to protect a property does not mean that we're able to. And so we wanted to add in a measure of feasibility into our database, because we don't want to spend a lot of time trying to buy land or appraise properties that will never come on the market and that we know will never come on the market. So it's not as though we know the inclination of every property owner out there, but if we do, we try to add this to our top 40 score system. So again, we have a sliding scale, 10 points. The owner is known and is willing to sell at fair market value. 5 points if there's a possible willing seller. We've made an initial inquiry and know that. 3 points if it's a possible willing seller, but we don't know. And 2 points, there's a known willing seller, but they want more than fair market value. There's typically always a few in this last basket, and we don't want to necessarily waste our time on those. Criteria number 8, future public use or access. Again, we got up to 10 points for this criteria. More and more, we're finding that public land conservation grant programs are very much interested in promoting and funding conservation projects where there is a public benefit that can come from public access. So our scale here goes from starting to 10 if there's a possibility of the land being placed in public ownership. 5 points if the property wouldn't be transferred, say, to wildlife resources as a game land, or to state parks as a state natural area, or to Brunswick County as a state park. But if the property could be owned by the Coastal Land Trust and perhaps opened for field trips every now and then, or under a license agreement, 5 points. If the property were to be remain privately owned, but possibly tours by permission of the landowner, and this scenario is one that we see frequently with conservation easement, only 1 point. Criteria number 9 is the funding feasibility. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the basic point is that a project can have a willing seller, a high conservation value. It can be subject to a future public access. In other words, it can knock the socks off all of our other criteria. Funding, again, it's not something that we can really afford to spend our time on. So we have a possible 10 points total. And as you'll see, this is sort of a sliding scale in 2 ways. The more expensive the property is, and the more grants, the cheaper the property is and the more grants they are, the higher it's going to rank. The more expensive the property is and the fewer public grants it might qualify for, the fewer points we give to the project under this criterion. Criterion number 10 is the threat of development and conversion. Certainly, it is much more urgent for us to try to acquire a project if there is imminent or high threat of development or conversion within the near term. Certainly, that is a project that would go to the top of our list. If it is owned, if it is high, which we think maybe the current owner is willing to keep the land without development at this point, but has probably a threshold of looking at it for development or sale in 6 to 10 years in the future, the points go down to 8. Medium development is possible, but it's located in a rural area. In other words, it's not highly threatened, only 5 points. We have included a score of 3 points if there is a risk of conversion of natural forest to agriculture, 3 points, and if there is the threat of timbering, we only give the project 1 point. We'd rather obviously buy intact systems than systems that we have to go back and restore. So that's our criteria, and I'm happy to say that we have had a top 40 list in effect for about 4 years now. And I'm going to give you an update of, first of all, a list of the top 40 projects that came out of that analysis and an update of the land conservation success that we have and have not had here at the Coastal Land Trust in protecting these sites. So we have divided this for purposes of this presentation into 3 regions, starting at the north, and we'll end up in the southeast. In the northeast and the Outer Banks regions, we came up with a lovely assemblage of top 40 projects. 3 sites along the Scuppernong River, 2 sites on Indiantown Creek, 2 sites at Ocracoke Island, where the Coastal Land Trust already has a beautiful nature preserve called Springer's Point, 1 project on the Northwest Landing River, 2 sites on the Chowan River, 1 site on the Roanoke River, and 2 sites on Salmon Creek up in Bertie County. And as you'll see at Ocracoke Island, we're happy to say that we have actually just purchased a small tract, less than 2 acres, but it was right in the middle of our preserve and looked over Pamlico Sound. And it would, if it had been developed, it would have really ruined the entire visitor experience. We purchased that property just this spring, and we have the only other remaining in-holding at Springer's Point Preserve under contract and hope to purchase it next spring. At the Chowan River, we've already saved 1 site of almost 1,000 acres. And I'm happy to tell you that we have another property actually for which we have a letter of intent, another 1,000-acre site, and we are taking that project to our board of directors later this month, and we hope to be able to save that one in a year or so. At Salmon Creek State Natural Area, those of you who are members of the Coastal Land Trust may remember that we have been extremely excited because we protected about 1,000 acres 3 years ago, borrowing money to do so. And as it turns out, it has artifacts that have been connected to the lost colony. So we purchased our initial tract here of about 1,000 acres. And then this year, we purchased an additional 300 acres adjacent to it. Both of those tracts have now been transferred to the North Carolina State Parks and are going to be the very first state natural area in the entire, I guess, 2 or 3 county region of Bertie and Chowan County. And I think there's 1 other county, but this is the first state park holding in that area. So we couldn't be more excited about that. And here's a map showing the top 40 projects in the Northeast region and the Outer Banks. We've not identified X marks the spot. We're not trying to scare off landowners and let them know that we are trying to purchase a particular parcel. So we've had a very large red circle bullseye on a very large general area. But as you'll see there where the check marks are, we have made significant progress already on protecting our top 40 sites in the Northeast region and the Outer Banks. In the Mid-Coast region, we have a whole host of projects. one site at Browns Island. That's actually the one remaining tract one of two remaining tracts rather, that are in private ownership. We've already protected 4 there. That's in Carteret County. Tracts adjacent to the Croatown National Forest, we've actually saved 2 areas there already, a total of 850 acres. One of our most exciting recent acquisitions, an amazing 5,500 acres, one site. It's down east. You'll have passed it if you drive from Beaufort out to the ferry landing over to Ocracoke. It's one of the largest acquisitions we've ever made. There are additions to the Goose Creek Game Land site, a Hyde County standalone site called Scranton Hardwoods, a historic site on the Tara River, the Gales Creek site, which I showed you a picture of earlier, that lovely longleaf pine forest, and Duck Creek Wetlands, which is a property right across the Neuse River from Newbern. And the picture there is Salters Creek. And actually I need to change the, it's actually in Carteret County, not Beaufort County. It is near Beaufort, but it is in Carteret County. And the property does have a lot of beautiful marshland, but it also has some longleaf pine as it goes into the uplands away from the creek. So we're very happy to have that. Most of it we've transferred to the Wildlife Resources Commission to be part of a public game lands there. And this is a map of the top 40 sites in the Mid-Coast region. And again, lots of happy blue check marks there, which I'm very proud of. And then closer to home, the Southeast region. Those of you who are familiar with the Coastal Land Trust know that this is obviously where we got our start here at the Coastal Land Trust on the lower Cape Fear River Basin. And for the first 10 years or so, we had an extraordinarily successful campaign of saving lands that were former rice plantations on the west banks of the Cape Fear River. But that's not all that's important in the Southeast region. There are 7 sites on the top 40 list within the Northeast Cape Fear River, 4 sites on the Waccamaw River. One of those sites, more than 3,000 acres, has already been saved. 6 sites on Town Creek in the lower Cape Fear. We do have 1 site that we have a letter of intent on, so we hope to be working on that in the future. 1 site at the Black River. Hoffman Forest is a site in and of itself, or at least there's a portion of that area. Some of that property is just in industrial timberland, but there are some natural areas there. South Topsail Beach is a tract that has great habitat and for nesting water birds. And there are 2 very interesting sites at Rocky Point that have some very interesting plants and geology due to some lime rock there. The picture there is the Northeast Cape Fear River. And here's our top 40 site map of the Southeast region. As you can see, we have not been quite as successful here as we have been, at least of late. But the good news is there's about 19,000 acres on the west banks of the Cape Fear that were protected before the top 40 sites were identified. So we're hoping that there will be more of those that will come to the fore in the future. And one thing I should also mention, we do have, I talked earlier about how military value is a significant factor in funding for projects. One of the reasons that we've been more effective recently in the Mid-Coast region and the Northeast region is because there are military installations in the Mid-Coast and the Northeast region. And we work with the Marine Corps at Cherry Point as its conservation partner in the Mid-Coast region. And we work with the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base as a partner in the Northeast region because they have flight paths from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base out to the Dare County bombing range. And we've been able to use military money to leverage projects in the Northeast in a way that we have not been able to do here in the Southeast, which is my home region. So that's a quick overview of how we are protecting the top 40 sites here in the coastal plain. I'd just like to say that there is always an urgent need for coastal conservation, but I think despite the pause that we have been seeing due to COVID and due to the real estate recession of a decade or so, there still is an urgent need for conservation areas to be protected here in the coastal plain of North Carolina. By 2030, our population is estimated to increase by 50% to 12 million people. We here in North Carolina lead the nation in lost farm and forest lands, more than 1 million acres in 10 years. 383 acres per day are converted to new roads, shopping malls, and housing developments. And the pattern of modern development is continuing to fragment the landscape migration corridors that are critically important to many of the species that used to make their homes here along the coastal plain. So in addition to identifying the need of the top 40 conservation sites here at the coastal plain, we also launched a capital campaign, the first in the history of the Coastal Land Trust. We call it the Your Land Campaign, and it is dedicated to finding the resources to preserve those top 40 sites, to save the irreplaceable. Our goal is actually to save 75% of the top 40 sites. And our initial goal, which we began about 4 years ago, was to raise $36 million, which sounds pretty extraordinary for a small land trust located here and based in Wilmington, North Carolina. And it is. We're not a big organization. We're not the Nature Conservancy. We're not the state of North Carolina. But we do have a lot of hardworking and dedicated people. And I'm happy to tell you that today, $31.4 million is committed. The bulk of that campaign goal is for land acquisition funds. 30 of the 36 million is for land acquisition. Just over 27 million is committed. And again, that's going to save 75% of the top land projects of our coastal plain. The other two goals are equally important. The Opportunity Fund is a fund that we have found to be critical because occasionally we find projects that are on the top 40 list and we can't move quickly enough just on our own to buy those properties because the public grant process takes between 18 and 24 months, sometimes even longer than that if more than one project, if more than one funding source is needed. And so we set the goal of creating a revolving land fund. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Fund have had such funds forever. We have not, and I'm happy to say that we have 2 million in our revolving loan fund, which we call the Opportunity Fund. The only problem from my standpoint, and it's not really a problem, is that it is limited to projects along the Croatan National Forest, the lands that protect those, or for longleaf. So we'd love to have more money there, maybe another million, so that we could use that money in any landscape along the coast, not just along the mid-coast. And then our other goal for the capital campaign is to raise $3 million for what we call the Promise Fund. And the Promise Fund includes the need to set aside an endowment so that as we buy land, and you guys know this just from your own homes and your own yards, whether or not you own any forests or natural lands, when you own property, it costs money, time, talent, money, whatever, to protect it and to keep it in good shape. And many of our properties need to be burned. So we need a stewardship endowment that is robust enough to ensure that we have the funds to take care of our land. And that includes not just the personnel to monitor them once a year, but to protect our boundaries and to make sure that there is no encroaching or trespass or other problem associated with our land. We can't prevent the problems, but we do have to respond to them. So for example, when we have hurricanes, or sometimes we have arson. We actually had an arson a few weeks ago. Sometimes we have people who do drug deals on our lands. We have to be able to respond to those and to protect the integrity of our preserves. So the Promise Fund is to set aside land for the future of the Coastal Land Trust, to honor our promise to preserve the lands that the Your Land campaign has allowed us to protect in perpetuity. So that is a brief overview of the program of the Coastal Land Trust, how we designed, how we use, and what our success has been with the top 40 conservation projects in the coastal plain of North Carolina, and our fundraising campaign called Your Land, Saving the Irreplaceable, which is dedicated to raising the funds to protect those top 40 projects. I've given my contact information here. I do want to say that I will be retiring at the end of December. There's a search process in place to identify a new leader. So I have given you not just my contact information, but also the contact information for Van Pearsall, our Director of Development, who will be here well after I'm gone. And he can answer any questions that you might have about contributing to the Your Land campaign, or if you have any other questions, he can help direct you to the right person on our staff who might be able to give you information if your questions are more related to conservation, biology, or land protection. So thank you very much. It has certainly been my pleasure to be able to speak with you here today. I admire the work that you are doing and hope to see all of you in real time after this pandemic is over.